Chapter 18. Journey. Milan. Hearing Lionel's voice, Milan reacted quickly. He took his tall F-grade tower shield and slammed it forward, ramming the C-grade invalid backward. Joel followed up, his F-grade pike piercing over Milan's shoulder as though the two were one. Just like that, another C-grade invalid fell. It had already been 3 days since they began following Lionel, but even Yuri, who had been the only one who wanted to reject his leadership, had her lips tightly sealed. Not to mention the fact a third of this group was made up of men who shared their lives with him on the football field for 4 years already. Even if this wasn't the case, the results spoke for themselves. They had fought tens of battles in just these 3 days, but not a single person had been injured. On top of this, they never met a group of invalids they couldn't handle. The most dangerous situation they had come across was a group of 10 D-grade invalids, but even that seemed to roll off their shoulders like it was nothing. Over time, the group gained more confidence and relaxed, their tense nerves loosening. Yet, they somehow didn't become complacent either. No, it wasn't a mistake. Joel, Milan, and James always followed Lionel's orders to the finest detail. It was they who set the example for the rest of them. Maybe it was only Yuri and the silent Aina who knew things shouldn't have been this easy. It wasn't a coincidence most of them only had F-grade treasures. The zones they had entered were only of that level, so they hadn't earned any rewards that were better. Despite only entering F-grade subdimensional zones, just look at how many of them had died. Over half of them would never see their families again. But somehow they were navigating seas of F to C-grade invalids as though they were nothing. Since when had the metamorphosis become such a joke? For a moment, Yuri had even believed that Lionel would thrust her into the front line as revenge. But he actually hadn't done that either. Looking toward Lionel, Yuri frowned. Lionel hadn't attacked a single time in these several days, but she was certain that the treasures on him were above the F-grade. And she had learned through deductions of her own that he had actually woken up before Aina, even though her lady had never said a word about just what was going on. Yuri had known Lionel for a long time. She knew he was intelligent. He was also quite fond of his personality. He was kind and respectful, the kind of man she wouldn't mind being with her miss. The problem was that he was too weak. But was he really weak? She didn't know anymore. Her gaze landed on Lionel's crossed arms. She could see his fingers digging firmly into his own tricep every time another invalid fell. Lionel looked up into the sky. Seeing the sun setting, he made a decision. Let's stop for today. The group was currently in the middle of what they had no choice but to call city ruins. This was the very advanced city that had once surrounded their third-ranked academy. But now, it was practically rubble. After the Paradise Islands fell from the skies, many of them lay the tall skyscrapers to waste. Even those buildings that weren't directly impacted collapsed after the fierce earthquakes. In order to find shelter for the night, the group had to dig through what was left of the buildings to see if they could find any basements that survived the collapse. Before, they were apprehensive. What would happen if they became trapped or worse, crushed to death? But Lionel seemed to be able to tell which were safe and which weren't. Though Lionel never fully explained exactly what his abilities were, everyone gained an almost infallible belief in them in just 3 days. Aina, if you don't mind, Lionel called out. Without a word, Aina walked to the slab of metal and stone Lionel pointed out and lifted it. It would never stop being weird seeing such a small girl lift such a massive load, but it was at the very least easier now than it had been in the past. Still, what felt the most uncomfortable for the group was the odd turn in the relationship between Aina and Lionel. They felt that in the past, Lionel would never ask Aina to do such menial work, nor would he speak to her so neutrally. He gave her commands and assignments no differently than he did to anyone else. The group collectively sighed and thanked Aina as they passed by. In the end, Aina slowly lowered the slab, sealing them off from the outside. The underground space they found this time had a decent 10 by 10 meter size. It gave them all more than enough space to themselves. As usual, Yuri brought out an F-grade tent that took up a bit more than half of the space, inviting the women of the group in. It was quite a convenient thing. Lionel had almost chosen a Tier 4 black treasure of similar abilities. Well, it would be known as a C-grade treasure by those of Earth. But he chose the bracelet still in his pocket instead. Also, as per usual, Savan hesitated, her steps pausing outside the tent. She glanced back toward Lionel with a complicated gaze before she eventually entered as well. How ironica. Lionel smiled bitterly to himself. In the past, it was Sivan who always protected Aina. Despite Lionel's overall good guy persona, she was even protective against him, shielding Aina from all the bad in the world. As a result, she had always been the most abrasive with him in comparison to Yuri. But now, their roles had inexplicably flipped. She was maybe the person who most understood how Lionel was feeling right now. Lionel sat down cross-legged, the metal container on his back clinking slightly against the stone. He closed his eyes, emptying his mind completely. Seeing his present state, James and the rest of the boys decided not to bother him, rolling out the sleeping bags Yuri had given them. They had no need for a scout to stay awake. They knew that Lionel alone would be enough. Yuri had given Lionel a sleeping bag as well, but he had never used it. She usually snorted when she saw him sitting on the cold stone floors every night, believing that his pride was overblown. But she had no idea the truth was that Lionel had simply gotten used to sleeping this way after months in the Mayan temple. Of course, he couldn't be bothered to explain this to her. Lionel sank into his own world. It was a weird state of mind, being empty, yet completely alert at the same time. Everything within a 50-meter radius of his body was entirely in his grasp. Just what is this ability of mine? I don't quite understand it even now. Lionel felt that he learned new facets of his ability every day. After he started practicing U-dimensional cleansing, new doors opened up constantly. There was only one problem with circulating U-dimensional cleanse, though. Whenever he did, invalids would sense their position far easier. During the first night, Lionel was forced to stop and sneak out silently in order to clear them away, something that left him completely sick to his stomach. From that day on, he only circulated U-dimensional cleanse at less than 1% of his ability. This slowed his progress, but it also allowed him to cultivate peacefully without interruption. With that, Lionel now locked down a new stat, Spirit. Lionel Morales. Strength, 0.72. Speed, 0.67, 0.1. Agility, 0.75. 0.9. Stamina, 0.99. Stamina, 0.7. 0.78. 0.99. Spirit, 0.99. Spirit was what Lionel classified as the ability to use that weird energy. Unlike his other stats that were measured by the limit of the human body, Lionel set one as the energy density of a Tier 9 black threat. After he categorized it this way, he immediately slotted himself in for 0.1. However, in 3 days it hadn't budged a single inch. Or, more accurately, it had, but Lionel couldn't register it sharply enough to put a number to it. Still, there were other outstanding effects. Lionel's reactions and coordination had improved to 0.999. It was only now he felt that the barrier to 1 was exceptionally thick. Luckily, though his coordination and reactions had slowed to a grinding halt, his other stats had also increased decently. Setting aside the boosts from his treasures, his speed had improved to 0.57, and his agility to 0.65. Of course, there was also the leap of 0.05 in his strength and the increase in his stamina to 0.73. From what Lionel could tell, these changes most definitely didn't come from E-dimensional cleansing. He had picked that technique primarily because it increased his spirit. His spirit, by extension, increased his coordination and reactions. In addition, his coordination had a positive impact on his agility. But spirit should have had next to no impact on his strength or speed. Simply put, Lionel had no idea where these stat increases were coming from. But his body seemed to be slowly improving over time at a pace that was out of his control. And whatever improvement, it seemed to not appear in the zones. It might be related to what Uncle Monte was saying about pseudo-fourth-dimensional constitutions. Maybe as a world evolves, its people do too. The closer Earth comes to the fourth dimension, the closer we all come to dropping that pseudo from our title. But if that's the case, why isn't anyone else experiencing this increase? Nay. Lionel's eyes flashed open. Something big is coming. Without a sound, Lionel jumped up. Everyone around him seemed to be soundly asleep already. Looking at the time, he should have been practicing O-dimensional cleanse for several hours. Making his way to a smaller second exit, Lionel exerted some strength and quietly left, appearing beneath the night sky and high-raised moonlight. B-grade Lionel sighed. The group he had taken out 2 nights ago were just a bunch of F-grade invalids. Their boosts to his stats were so minuscule that Lionel knew they couldn't have had an impact on his stat increases. Though this quickly approaching invalid was of the B grade, Lionel wasn't afraid despite the fact he knew the priest he had struggled with so much was still a sliver away from the B grade himself. There was something Lionel had realized over these few days. First, invalids weren't as intelligent as humans, making them less dangerous than the bosses of zones. Second, not all invalids had the same abilities. They personified the abilities they would have had they survived the awakening process. Simply put, the priest was a C-grade spirit-type entity. This made him especially dangerous to a naive youth like Lionel, who knew little of this world of powers and abilities. The priest's spirit had actually been much higher than Lionel's current stat. This was all to say that a B-grade speed-type invalid like the one rushing toward Lionel now was much easier to deal with. "Why'd you have to come here?" Lionel stood atop the rubble, his left hand calmly reaching toward his back and his right pulling his white, boned atlatl from his waist. 40 meters, sir. 30, you've long since gotten too close. Now oh. A beautiful silver dart with feathers of white to one end appeared in Lionel's hand. It was just about 1.5 meters in length, looking more like a work of art as it sat atop Lionel's atlatl, instead of the deadly weapon it was. Cocking his arm back and releasing with barely 20% of his ability, Lionel allowed a line of silver to cut across the skies, reflecting the dull moonlight. The invalid who dashed forward like a vampire in the night was suddenly struck in the forehead, a hole as thin as a bullet wound bloodying its skull. With a heavy heart, Lionel crossed the 20-meter distance between them. His use of call of the window was already too refined for an enemy to survive at such a close distance. Bending down the side of the invalid who was beginning to turn to motes of light, he caught a glimpse of its face. On the last day he rode his bike to school, the day of the championship game, this invalid had been among those to greet him and wish him luck. He even said he bet on Lionel to succeed with Aina that time around. By this point it felt like a lifetime ago. Lionel picked up his dart. It was slightly damaged, but if his treasure could build darts from raw materials, why wouldn't it have the ability to repair ones with nicks and scratches? To now, Lionel still had all 200 it came with. "I guess that's it for tonight. I'll head back and rest." Lionel suddenly looked over his shoulder, frowning. He thought he had sensed something, but there was nothing. Just as Lionel was about to investigate further, his mind trembled. An inconspicuous black wristband on his arm that seamlessly blended into his flexible armor silently tugged him in a certain direction. A zone had appeared, but not just that, it was within 500 meters of this place. But what truly shook Lionel was the fact he sensed not just 1 but 7 A-grade invalids. It was only then Lionel realized the appearance of his B-grade underclassmen wasn't a coincidence. Could it be that zone openings attracted invalids too? Chapter 19. A Grade Invalid 1. Lionel closed his eyes, a deep unwillingness sinking into his heart. That day when the virgin sacrifice almost strangled him to death, he really had resigned himself. He had even said goodbye to his father. Yet, he woke up. How was he supposed to feel about that exactly? Was he supposed to think he was forgiven for the 1,000 deaths that lay squarely on his shoulders? Uncle Montez had said it clearly. Subdimensional zones were points in Earth's history where an event that connected to the 4th dimension occurred. In other words, they were real. Every throat he pierced, every head he severed, every life that slipped away, they were all real. Lionel had a hard time dealing with that. The reason he had smiled so brightly when he finally saw Aina again was because he thought that she was his light, the only pure thing remaining in his life. But she shattered that image barely a moment later. In truth, Lionel didn't even know what he was fighting for anymore. He guessed it was just some primal instinct to survive, but he couldn't think of much else. Clearly his parents weren't that much of a motivating factor considering how easily he had given up in the temple. What the hell is wrong with me? Lionel might have just turned 18, but he was just a kid in the end. He knew that he didn't want to be a quarterback for the rest of his life, but he never really thought about what exactly he wanted to do outside of that. Lionel chuckled to himself as 7 A-grade invalids converged. By now, it wasn't just them anymore, but numerous lower-level invalids who crept forward as well. The most important part of my identity all that time was just liking her, huh? I don't know whether I should be sad or laugh some more. Nary. The truth was that Leonel was trying his best to find a reason to fight back, to put his life on the line once again, and bloody his hands once more. For his parents? He had already tried that once before. For Aina? He didn't even know if he still felt the same way about her. For his friends, Leonel thought of James, his best friend for as long as he could remember. To this day, he still didn't know why James tried to throw the championship game. He didn't know why he hadn't just let him do it either. They had already won 3 times, and winning a 4th would have been meaningless. I know you too well. You don't like to lose, but you're too soft-hearted to call me out on my bullshit too. So, you'd find a way to protect our friendship and ignore it, all while winning the big game anyway. Am I right? James' words to him reverberated in Leonel's mind. He suddenly felt his hands moving of their own accord, sliding 3 silver bars out and screwing them together. I guess it'll just have to be that simple then all. He didn't like to lose. It was an immature thought, one you would expect from an 18-year-old boy. If Leonel thought any more deeply about it, he too would find it ridiculous that he was trading what he thought was his moral code for a will to win. But the reality was that Leonel was looking for something, for anything, to give him a reason to keep going. The reason never mattered at all. Leonel clicked the hidden button on his silver rod. The moment his bike fully formed, he jumped onto it, riding up the side of a massive slab of broken wall and jumping 5 meters into the air. In that instant of time he spent in the air, his gaze captured everything. 2 are within 100 meters. 4 are between 100 and 300. The last one is further than 400 meters away. It wasn't that Leonel's gaze landed on them all. Rather, it was that he found it easier to feel out the fluctuating energies without so many buildings in the way. Leonel had run across a grade invalids before, in the last 3 days, that is. He knew how sensitive they were to humans. It took a lot of effort to shake just one off. If these 7 caught sight of their base, Leonel would no longer be able to guarantee everyone's safety. Even James' 10-second shield could only block a single grade attack. The higher the grade, the exponentially more difficult the invalid was to handle. Their stats not only became more well-rounded, but their intelligence wasn't so easy to fool anymore either. Leonel's knees bent as he landed on the ground, expertly using his high coordination to balance on the rubble before shooting forward once more. He controlled his bike with a single handle and used the other to grab a dart, shifting it around in his fingers until he could both grab his atlatl and fit it to it at the same time. In a flash, Leonel rounded the corner of a building that seemed just an inch away from falling completely over. Half of its top was completely shaved off, having fallen to the other side of the street. He made eye contact with those cold, emotionless white pupils. They locked onto Leonel with a concealed, murderous intent, as though it was still slinking in the shadows. The invalid was long and lanky, having a back so arched that the back of its hands almost dragged along the ground. Despite its lazy appearance, it dodged Leonel's first dart with ease, despite being just 20 meters away. Its lanky body curled at an impossible angle, its head arching back so far that its skull nearly cracked against the ground. Coordination of 0.87. Its host body should have an ability related to disconnecting and reconnecting bones, making it an expert of close combat. It has good speed, strength, and reactions. As far as Leonel could tell, F-grade beings had stats between 0.5 and 0.6. D-grade entered the up to 0.7 realm. C-grade was usually up to 0.8. B-grade was below 0.85, with a grade being below 0.9. Leonel wasn't certain about the SSS and SS grades. In addition, the spirit stats seemed to work a lot differently. The priest had only been a 0.05 on Leonel's scale, but he was most definitely a C-grade threat. Of course, these were only averages. Some could cross barriers by having less stats, but being more well-rounded. This grade invalid happened to have more of its stats in coordination and reactions, though its strength and speed were still above 0.6. How unfortunate. Without hesitation, he pedaled into a 10-meter radius in a flash, jumping into the air and turning his bike back into a silver rod. Your strengths happen to be my strengths. But Tom, I'm a level better. Name. Lionel clashed with the A-grade invalid. His movements were wild and almost without reason. Anyone could see with a glance that he had never been formally trained. And yet those very same wild movements seemed simple and precise to the point of suffocation. After a moment you would realize that it wasn't that Lionel's style of battle was usually this wild, it was that he was actually adapting his fighting style to match that odd style of the lanky invalid. The invalid's arm suddenly doubled in length, shooting toward Lionel, but a step ahead, Lionel had already tilted his head to the side. He had already seen through this invalid's ability. Why wouldn't he be ready for such a change? Lionel took a strong step forward. His silver rod spun in his hand, its butt rounding in a beautiful semicircular arc and crushing the invalid's windpipe. He released his rod with a hand, reaching to his back and pulling out a dart he stabbed through the invalid's eye and skull. Pulling his dart out, he had already turned his silver rod back into a bicycle and dashed away. By the time he scooped up the dart that initially missed and tossed it back into his steel container, the invalid had collapsed to the ground, dead. The other is already closing in. There's no way it won't sense them within 50 meters. But before that, it should be meandering on instinct. I need to intercept. Lionel felt the motes of lights meld with his body, but he didn't have much of a reaction. His face held an expressionless visage to it. There was no joy, nor was there any anger. He cut a tight corner, riding up the side of a collapsed building and hopping across to the roof of another. He spun his bike to the side, dragging its tires along the ground to a searing halt that left a cloud of dust in his wake. Lionel hopped off, eyeing his target in the distance. He spread out his stance, his base becoming impeccably sturdy as he tightened his torso. A dart appeared in his hand, sliding perfectly into his atlatl. Throwing a spear while on his bike was one matter. He couldn't rely on his legs for power, only his arm. However, when his feet were planted firmly on the ground, he was a completely different animal. Oh! Lionel's arm shot forward like a cannon, his dart whistling through the air with a sharp sound. Call of the Wind could only be considered to have been mastered to the entry level by Lionel. Yet he was already capable of throwing his darts at 250 kilometers per hour. The target invalid was almost like a miniature giant. In fact, it dragged its feet around completely in the nude. Obviously, whatever clothes its host had been wearing had been ripped to shreds. What remained was a bestial man that stood at over 2 meters tall. But what was exceptionally striking was its wide body. It was almost shaped like a box. Lionel had already seen that its strength stat was at 0.95. It was one of the variant cases of a stat, surpassing its grade. However, the reason it could only be of the A grade is because, its other stats were too low. Hulking Invalide. Strength, 0.95. Speed, 0.47. Agility, 0.15. Coordination, 0.56. Stamina, 0.89. Reactions, 0.51. Spirit, 0.51. Aside its strength and stamina, its other stats could barely be considered of the F grade, some not even that. So when Lionel attacked from just 30 meters away with a dart that looked no different from a shooting star across the night sky, the massive invalid couldn't even blink before its eye was pierced and half its brain turned to mush. Lionel Morales. Strength, 0.73. Speed, 0.67. 0.1. Agility, 0.75. 0.9. Coordination, 0.9. Stamina, 0.78. 0.5. Lionel's strength stat ticked up by 0.01. This was the first substantial change he had ever run across after absorbing an invalid's energy. There probably existed a technique that improved the efficiency, but he didn't think too much about it. In truth, Lionel more so wished for increases to his stamina. He had only killed 2 A-grade invalids, but he already felt it was eating into his reserve strength. 5 left. Lionel gritted his teeth, pedaling hard.